Welcome to the Kroll Lens, a series navigating the regulatory landscape. In this series, Kroll's regulatory experts help you navigate the evolving regulatory environment. As an award-winning provider of compliance and regulatory consulting services to the financial services industry, Kroll helps clients to develop, implement, and manage their compliance and regulatory consulting programs. In today's episode, Kroll's Nicola Norfolk, Mark Turner, and Matteo Basso discuss how firms' governing bodies play a critical role in ensuring good outcomes for customers.
Hello, everybody. I'm Nicola Norfolk, a director within regulatory consulting team at Kroll. Welcome to our first in a series of Kroll Consumer Duty podcasts. I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Turner, Managing Director, Regulatory Consulting, and Matteo Basso, Managing Director, Regulatory Consulting. They're going to be addressing the question, is governance the key to success of the consumer duty? Now, by way of background, the FCA has been very clear that it sees firms' governing bodies as playing a critical role in ensuring consumer duty is a success. For example, we've heard in a speech by the Consumers and Competition Executive Director Sheldon Mills, and I quote, "Change won't be possible unless driven from the top by strong senior championing and oversight." Therefore, this podcast will look at the role of the governing body at your firm in helping the FCA to achieve the key aims of consumer duty. Now, we know that the new requirements expect boards to commission an annual report. So, Mark, could you tell us more about what would be expected in the annual report and when boards would be expected to comply with this requirement?
Yes, so thank you, Nicola. Thank you, and I think the first thing that boards should be thinking about is just to make sure before they launch into the report that they understand what the FCA's key drivers are here. And Nicola, you mentioned some comments from the FCA, and I think it's really important that firms don't lose sight of what this consumer duty is all about, and to look at another quote that Sheldon Mills at the FCA made as this was launched, that the FCA is looking to raise the bar for firms that they regulate and prevent harm from happening, as well as to make it easier for them to act quickly and assertively where they spot new problems. So it's worth boards bearing that in mind before they jump into the details of these reports. So I think with that in mind, what boards should be doing is also to look at the exercise that they need to do before they jump into the report is to look at the scoping that's been done. So you'd expect that firms boards will look to the executives to the executive management to have conducted a scoping exercise to determine which parts of their business are affected by the consumer duty. I know, and we know from some of the discussions that we've had with various clients and people across the industry, that sometimes the assumptions that certain firms are entirely outside of scope of the consumer duty don't always hold, and so it's really important that scoping exercise is done up front, looking at, well, does the firm conduct retail market activity, does it contract with retail customers, and then maybe the more tricky and nuanced piece is it in a position through its business to determine or have material influence over the design or operations of products and services that may be offered, even where those products and services may not be offered directly to retail consumers by the firm, and then they'll look at whether exemptions are apply. So, assuming that exercise has been done and that the board has got sight of that of the outcomes of that, then we can turn to the report itself. So, just sort of emphasizing the key points that the FCA have made in terms of its expectations. Report as a minimum should contain the results of monitoring that has been conducted to assess whether products and services are producing the expected good consumer outcomes, where the identification of poor outcomes and the groups that are impacted and the root cause, where such poor outcomes have been identified, which can be through proactive measures. It can be also through reaction to interactions with customers, and through complaints and things like that. that there is an action plan to address the poor outcomes. And I think within the report, the action plan will need to consider the specifics of poor outcomes have been identified, but also coming back to that point I just made on root cause, to think a little bit broader. So I think this is where again the board has a role to play, to be thinking about, okay, is this telling us something that maybe has a more an impact on other parts of our business, or indeed the culture of the firm. And then also within the report, a statement detailing how the firm's business strategy is consistent with acting to deliver good outcomes under the consumer duty. So the FCA has said that the report should be commissioned annually, with the first report being available to the board 1 year after the implementation date of the rules. So for firms offering new products and services, board should have approved the new report by July 2024. The board will be required to receive and approve the detailed report at least annually on consumer outcomes and the firm's performance, including the remedial actions, rather, as I just mentioned, where any activity has been identified that's leading to poor outcomes. And then the final point I'll make is around accountability, which I know we're going to talk about a bit more later. But where remedial activities are required, those should be clearly allocated to accountable individuals and tracked by the board all the way through to their completion.
Great, thank you, Mark. Matteo, your team provides day-to-day support to clients on matters relating to compliance. Is there anything you would be advising firms' boards to start thinking about now in order to be fully prepared for the annual report? For example, maybe you can touch on MI requirements.
Yes, thank you, Nicola. Indeed, the FCA has been clear that a key part of the duty is that firms are able to assess, understand, and evidence the outcomes their customers are receiving. So by looking at these points in order, really, the boards need to ensure that the firms have carried out an appropriate scoping exercise, as Mark has explained, looking at all relevant products, target markets, distribution channels, and that appropriate processes are in place to assess the consumers are receiving the expected outcomes. So the second step is, understanding. So firms need to ensure that there are collective capabilities and knowledge on the boards to understand the new obligations under the consumer duty, and also understand the expected underlying customer outcomes. So there might be, for certain firms, an element of training and development that is required at board level. And finally, as you mentioned, evidencing the outcomes. So how do you meet the outcomes? And that's where management information, or MI, as you called it, is in place to become, and it becomes essential in order to demonstrate that consumers are receiving good outcomes. And where they don't, allowing boards to identify promptly issues and the actions that are required to remedy such issues. So while firms and boards already have processes, oversight processes in place, and MI that has been produced in board packs to comply with the existing regulatory framework, the duty will likely require a mindset shift from metrics that purely report on inward-looking compliance with current processes and regulations to a more outward-looking point of view, focusing on the outcomes experienced by clients. So these are subtle difference, but it could be easily overlooked by some firms, and with the result that you might struggle to demonstrate compliance with the FCA expectations on the new duty. So firms should review their existing MI to ensure it provides the right balance of qualitative and quantitative information, and also allowing the management to identify and remedy poor outcomes, as I mentioned earlier, being received across the product life cycle. So really, I think what firms need to do and the boards need to be aware of is that you need to think about how to bake in your consumer duty obligations and the outcomes into your MI packs, allowing good governance and oversight processes to be in place. Some clients might want to look at it as a blank canvas, so just looking at starting from the outcomes and thinking about what MI do I need to demonstrate compliance with those. rather than starting from the current MI. So that might be a preferable solution sometimes, and allows you really to think about what am I trying to achieve here, and what processes do I need to substantiate my compliance with the obligations, and then take action to implement any new processes or fill in any gaps in the information that you currently assess at board level. Just to give you a maybe real life example, most firms will have, as part of their regular reporting to the board, information about complaints statistics, which is important to be seen, and but to comply with compliance, to comply with the new consumer duty, further context might be received, might be needed. For example, as the information about the root cause of the complaint, or the product or service to which it is attributed to, in order to identify trends or where maybe action might be needed. And often this additional context or the ability to join the dots is missing from MI data being presented to senior management or governing bodies. So that could be an area where we often see clients struggling with, and additional steps being required to comply with the duty.
So turning to SMCR, we've seen the new consumer duty places much more of an onus on firms' governing bodies for ensuring good customer outcomes. But we may ask ourselves, where does the consumer duty and SMCR actually cross over? So Mark, as our expert on SMCR, can you share your views on this? Has much changed within SMCR as a result of consumer duty?
Thanks, Nicola. So I think the first thing I'd say is that the consumer duty and the way that the FCA has positioned it and the way that it expects firms to respond is consistent with the spirit, if you like, of SMCR. So I spoke a moment ago about accountability, and Matteo just also touched on the fact that that this is the consumer duty is very much an outcomes focused regulation. So I think there's nothing in here which creates any sort of conflict between the objectives of SMCR and the objective of the new consumer duty. So I think for those people who are senior managers under the senior managers regime part of SMCR, clearly there are some accountabilities that we've talked about already, around things like any remediation activity that might be required where consumer, less good consumer outcomes are identified, expecting those to roll up to an accountable senior manager. We have a requirement for a consumer duty champion, which will often be somebody who's in a senior manager position, either which could be a board director, could be another senior manager. There is a new conduct rule that is being introduced, which will apply to nearly all staff, which again is sits under SMCR, but just emphasises the consumer angle, and goes maybe slightly beyond the treating customers fairly wording that existed before under COCON, and now moving towards good consumer outcomes. So I think that the theme of accountability is very much embedded within consumer duty, and that's consistent with SMCR. So as a senior manager, what should senior managers be thinking about specifically? As referenced by 3 of the senior manager conduct rules, the requirement to consider, reasonable steps as a senior manager. What does that look like with the lens of consumer duty? Matteo just spoke about management information. So management information certainly has a role to play in terms of supporting the evidencing of senior managers taking reasonable steps to ensure that consumers are getting good outcomes under this duty. There's also, I think, under the guidance that's been issued by the FCA under COCON, some of it's quite quite nuanced, but I think there's definitely a drive to a more proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. So again, senior managers should be thinking about, well, not just responding where less good things are identified, but also being proactive in thinking ahead. Okay, so for example, maybe there's new products, there's changes to the business model, there's changes to strategy, changes in the macroeconomic environment that might, for example, mean that more end consumers are vulnerable. All these things are things that senior managers should be thinking about as they are discharging their accountabilities in relation to consumer duty under SMCR. Now, what this doesn't mean, particularly for large firms, that the senior managers are responsible for every single activity that supports consumer duty. So again, if we think back to the deliberate design of SMCR in the first place, which was about ensuring that senior managers are absolutely accountable for the activities across the firm, but that some of that, the way that they discharge those accountabilities and indeed take reasonable steps is around effective oversight, and not necessarily in all cases, particularly for larger firms, senior managers doing all the operational things that will support these firms' obligations, including under consumer duty. So effective oversight is core, and again, MI, both in terms of its design, its operation, how effective MI can be as a mechanism to draw out both issues as they happen, but also to be forward-looking, to think about horizon scanning, as I just said, around things like changes in the model and how that might have an impact on consumer outcomes. Because another aspect of consumer duty is the requirement to consider foreseeable harm, and so again, I think when you put your senior manager's hat on, thinking about, well, what is foreseeable, and again, the FCA has issued some guidance that it's what's reasonable. No individual has a crystal ball and can look into the future and can foresee things like market movements or indeed macroeconomic events, but there are things that firms can consider and that senior managers need to be thinking about having oversight over. So, for example, if a firm is involved in either the design or the distribution, or has an influence over design or distribution of a product with certain new features that are maybe targeting a particular client type or a particular need in the market that maybe could have an impact on consumer outcomes, and there is a risk of certain harms that maybe are different from harms that exist in the current product mix that the firm's involved in. Well, proactively thinking and doing an exercise of saying, well, okay, well, let's brainstorm what harms could exist here. Thinking about things like stresses to the macro environment, stresses to the business, stresses to the consumers that you're targeting, and thinking about, well, what harms could happen, and can we manage those in a proactive basis. So I think thinking 2 steps ahead is definitely something that consumer duty is encouraging, and I think for those individuals that are senior managers, they should be thinking about, given the fact that they are accountable ultimately for all the activities of a firm under SMCR, well, how can they put themselves in the best position to support the end consumer, and also to think about their own risks as senior managers and how best they can demonstrate compliance under this regime and under the requirements under the senior manager conduct rules.
Thank you, Mark, for your insight on SMCR. It seems then that consumer duty has certainly placed more accountability onto the shoulders of senior management. So just taking everything into account, what we've spoken about here today, what are your closing remarks to the key question of this podcast? Is governance the key to success of consumer duty? Matteo, perhaps we could have your views first.
Yes, I think the answer is yes, absolutely. You need good governance, or actually, maybe I rephrase that. You are less likely to achieve good outcomes for your consumers unless you have a robust and appropriate governance arrangements in place. And even if you do, then it might be very difficult for you to demonstrate to the FCA or to the consumers that you're doing so without the appropriate records, documentation, MI, as we talked about. One thing that we haven't touched on is proportionality, which is something that is maybe relevant just to mention briefly. It's recognized by the regime, so some of the points that we've talked about today will be more or less relevant, or you might have to do more or less work depending on the type of firm, the products, the underlying targets, the target markets that you are selling your products to. But nevertheless, it is expected every firm touched by the consumer duty will have to think about governance as with the key pillar on how they can demonstrate compliance with the new requirements.
Thank you, Matteo. Mark, do you have anything that you'd like to ask to Matteo's response?
Yes, so just to add to that, I mean, is governance the key to success? It's certainly one of the keys to success. Of course, governance does rely on the process that sit beneath it, but of course, I think one of the roles that particularly the boards can play here is to ask those questions of the executive, particularly in larger firms, around, well.
Thank you to both Mark and Matteo for their interesting insights and views on the role and importance of governance within consumer duty. I would like to draw your attention to the review issued by the FCA on the 25th of January on how firms are planning to implement the duty. The review contains key findings, examples of good practice, and also examples of where firms may need to improve their implementation approach. So in terms of governance, the key points are FCA will continue to be holding firms, including their senior managers and boards, accountable for delivering good outcomes for customers. Make sure you have appointed your consumer duty champion, and don't forget, evidence, evidence, evidence is key to good governance. Make sure you, as senior management, continue to challenge and ensure that that challenge is documented in the minutes of the meeting. So there's certainly a lot for firms to think about, but please do also look out for our other consumer duty podcasts.
On our next episode, we'll look at consumer duties for small and medium-sized enterprises. Kroll's expert Matt Austin and Paul Heffernan will look at the third line of defense function for regulated firms in helping the FCA to achieve the key aims of consumer duty.